The clippers
Make sure you
screamed
get
like
all of it,
a wounded
soldier.
animal
Yes,
as they
sir.
bit into her
Almost
scalp,
done.
and the rain
Good.
came down
Finish
in
up and
sheets
report.
so
Yes,
thick
sir.
you could barely see the woman sitting on the stool in the center of the parade ground. Her hair fell in dark clumps around her boots, soaking into the mud.
Hello,
and the
I
men
have a
standing
delivery
in
for you.
formation did not move,
Oh, thank you.
did not breathe.
You're welcome. Have a good day.
72 hours earlier, none of them had ever heard the name Reagan Hollister. 72 hours earlier, she was just another woman stepping off a dusty transport
Hold on.
truck
I've
at
got you.
Fort Iron Horse,
It
Nevada,
hurts. The letter?
with nothing to her name
Safe.
but a
Stay
duffel
with me.
bag and a
Thank you.
file so empty it might as well have been blank paper. Let us go back to that moment. Let us go back to the beginning, before the clippers, before the rain, before the general's voice cracked the desert air in half. The transport rattled up the long gravel road that led to the front gate of Fort Iron Horse just after dawn on a Tuesday morning in April of 2026. The sky above the Nevada high desert was the color of old tin, and the wind carried the smell of creosote and diesel. When the truck hissed to a stop, the rear gate dropped with a metallic clang, and a woman stepped down onto the gravel. She was tall, though not unusually so, and she moved with the quiet economy of someone who had spent a long time learning not to waste motion. Her hair was pulled back in a simple dark ponytail. Her uniform was faded at the elbows, and the knees the kind of faded that only comes from years of honest wear. She carried one duffel bag over her left shoulder. That was all. Her name was Reagan Hollister, and she was 42 years old. The men at the gate did not salute her. There was no reason to. Her collar was bare. Her sleeves were bare. Her cap bore no insignia of rank. To every pair of eyes that fell on her that morning, she was nothing more than a transfer, a body sent down from somewhere higher up the chain to be processed and broken and sorted like every other body that passed through Fort Iron Horse. The guard at the gate waved her through with a lazy flick of his wrist, and she walked up the long paved road toward the intake building without hurry and without hesitation. She had walked ground like this before. The guard could not have known that. No one could have known that. But there was something in the way she placed her feet, something in the way her eyes moved across the base without moving her head, something in the quiet certainty of her breathing that would have told an honest man he was looking at a soldier who had seen things he would never see. The trouble with Fort Iron Horse on that Tuesday morning in April was that there were no honest men left in it. The intake building was a low flat structure with peeling paint and a window unit air conditioner that wheezed like a dying dog. Inside, at a gray metal desk cluttered with paperwork, sat a man with a belly that strained against the buttons of his uniform shirt and a toothpick jammed into the corner of his mouth. His name was Sergeant Buck Merrick, and he had been at Fort Iron Horse for 19 years. He had watched 1,000 recruits come through that door, and he had broken most of them. He took pride in that. It was the only thing in his life he still took pride in. When Reagan Hollister walked through the door and set her duffel bag down on the concrete floor, Sergeant Merrick did not look up. He made her stand there for a full minute, then two, pretending to read a form he had read 100 times before. When he finally raised his eyes, he let them travel slowly from her boots to her face, and what she saw in those eyes was not surprise or curiosity or even hostility. What she saw was boredom, the boredom of a man who had already decided before she said a single word that she was not worth his time. He flipped open her file. Inside was one sheet of paper, her name, a transfer code, nothing else. No commendations, no prior postings, no service history, no next of kin, just a name and a number on a page so white it almost glowed under the fluorescent light. Sergeant Merrick let out a short barking laugh that had nothing of humor in it. Well, 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 look at what the wind blew in. You lost, sweetheart, because this ain't no day spa. She did not answer. She did not need to. Her orders spoke for themselves, and her orders had put her in this room. He slammed the file shut and jerked his head toward the door. Barracks C bunk in the corner. Get in line with the rest of the trash. We'll see how long you last. She picked up her duffel bag. She walked out the door. She did not look back. Barracks C sat at the far end of the compound, the oldest building on the base, a long wooden structure with a leaking roof and a row of cracked windows that faced the latrines. When she pushed open the door, the air inside hit her like a wet rag. Mildew, sweat, the sharp chemical bite of a latrine pipe that had been leaking for longer than anyone cared to fix. There were 8 bunks in the room, and 7 of them were occupied by women in various stages of unpacking. They all stopped what they were doing when she walked in. They all looked at her, and then they all looked at the 8th bunk. Someone had gotten there first. Her mattress was flipped upside down on the floor, soaking in a puddle of what she hoped was water and suspected was not. Her locker door hung off one hinge, the metal twisted where something heavy had pried it open. Her assigned sheets lay crumpled in the corner, stained with something dark. The other women watched her waiting. They expected her to shout. They expected her to cry. They expected her to march back to the intake building and demand to know who had done this because that was what every other recruit had done when this same trick had been pulled on them. Reagan Hollister did none of those things. She set her duffel bag down on the wet concrete. She knelt. She picked up the sheets and carried them to the sink at the end of the room. She wrung them out with hands that were steady and patient and deceptively delicate, and she hung them to dry on the frame of her broken locker. She righted the mattress. She did not ask for a new one. She laid the damp sheets back across the bare metal springs, tucked the corners with the crisp precision of a woman who had made 1,000 bunks in her life, and sat down on the edge of the bed. Then she looked up at the other women. She did not say a word. She only looked at them, and one by one they looked away. That night she slept on bare metal springs in a damp room that smelled of sewage. She did not shiver. She did not toss. She slept the way a soldier sleeps in a foxhole, one layer of consciousness, always awake, listening. At 4:30 in the morning, 15 minutes before the bugle sounded, her eyes opened on their own. She sat up. She dressed. Her uniform was pressed and crisp somehow, despite the damp and the case of the night before. When the other women stumbled out of their bunks, rubbing their eyes, they found her already standing at attention at the foot of her bed, and something in the way she stood there made the loudest one among them swallow her joke and then look at the floor. The mess hall that morning was a long, tin-roofed building that rang with the clatter of trays and the shouts of cooks. Reagan stepped into the line with her tray, held at the correct angle, her eyes forward, and when she reached the server, a greasy-haired private who had been tipped off by Sergeant Merrick's men, a ladle of watery gray grits, was dumped onto her tray with a wet slap. She watched the eggs and the toast and the bacon go onto the trays of the recruits behind her. She said nothing. She moved down the line. A recruit named Rhett Barrett, 22 years old, stuck his boot out into the aisle as she passed. He had been dared to do it, and he had agreed because he wanted the older men to like him. His timing was good. His aim was better. The toe of his boot caught her shin at exactly the angle that should have sent her sprawling. She stepped over it like she had seen it coming from across the room. Rhett Barrett blinked. He would think about that small moment for the rest of his life. But another recruit, seeing the first attempt fail, bumped her hard from behind, and this time the tray flew from her hands and hit the concrete floor with a crash that echoed through the mess hall. The watery grits splattered across her boots and across the floor in a wide gray circle, and the laughter that followed was the laughter of men who had been waiting all morning for permission to laugh. From the officer's dais at the end of the hall, a voice cut through the noise. "Clean it up, recruit." Major Damian Voss was 44 years old, tall and lean and handsome, in a way that had curdled over the years into something sour. His uniform was immaculate. His boots shone like black glass. He stood on the dais with a clipboard in his gloved hand, and he pointed at her with one manicured finger. "Clean it up, and you don't get seconds. Learn to walk before you try to eat." She knelt. She pulled a handful of napkins from the dispenser. She scrubbed the floor while 200 men watched and laughed, and her stomach was empty, and her face was calm, and when she was finished, she carried the soaked napkins to the trash bin and dropped them in and walked out of the mess hall without ever having eaten a bite. Major Voss watched her go. There was something in the way she walked that bothered him. He could not name it. He would not name it until it was far too late. The obstacle course ran along the western edge of the base, a cruel ribbon of mud and rope and splintered wood that curved around the foot of a low ridge. The sun that afternoon was merciless. It turned the dirt into a flat gray plate that shimmered in the heat, and the air above the course rippled like water. Reagan stood at the end of the line of recruits with her hands at her sides and her shoulders square, and when Sergeant Merrick gave the order to run, she ran. She was fourth to the cargo net. She climbed it the way a woman climbs a staircase in her own house, and that was when Sergeant Merrick decided she needed a lesson. The fire hose lay coiled against the fence at the base of the net, a heavy black snake connected to a hydrant that was used only to wash down the armored vehicles. Merrick picked it up. He cranked the valve. The water came out of the nozzle in a solid white column at 40 pounds of pressure, and he aimed it square at her face as she reached the top of the net. The blast hit her like a hammer. Her head snapped back. Her hands, which had been gripping the wet rope, nearly tore free. For one long second, she hung there by her legs alone, suspended 40 feet in the air, while the water pounded her chest and her face and her scalp. The recruits below her stopped climbing. Some of them laughed. Some of them did not. She locked her knees around the webbing. She reached up blindly through the deluge. She found the top rail of the net with her fingertips, and she pulled. She came over the top of the net in a single clean roll and dropped to the other side and kept running. Major Voss was at the bottom of the rope descent when she reached it, stopwatch in his hand. You missed a foothold. Disqualified. Run it again. She ran it again. The other recruits watched from the shade, panting their water bottles, sweating in their hands. She ran it a second time. Her lungs burned. Her legs shook. Voss did not look up from his clipboard. Run it again. She ran it a third time. When she crossed the finish line for the third time, her uniform black with mud and water, her hair plastered to her skull, she did not collapse. She did not lean on her knees. She straightened her back. She put her hands at her sides. She stood at attention and waited for the next order. Major Voss looked at her for a long time. Then he flipped a page on his clipboard and walked away. That evening, as the sun went down behind the ridge and the shadows grew long across the compound, Reagan sat alone on the edge of her bunk in Barracks E and closed her eyes. The other women were at chow. The barracks was quiet. In the stillness, something moved behind her eyes, a memory she had not allowed herself to touch in a very long time. A village in the mountains south of Mitrovica in Kosovo in the winter of 2013. Snow falling so heavy it muffled the sound of the gunfire a kilometer away. A stone farmhouse with a collapsed roof, and a man lying on the cold floor with his back against a broken wall, his breath coming in white clouds that grew smaller and smaller. His name was Sergeant Eli Marsh. He was 31 years old. He was from Dayton, Ohio. He had a mother named Opal who baked him chocolate chip cookies every Christmas and sent them in a tin can wrapped in brown paper. He had told Reagan all of these things over the long months they had served together in a unit that did not officially exist, running operations that would not appear in any record for 50 years if they ever appeared at all. And now Eli Marsh was dying in her arms on the floor of a farmhouse in a country he could not find on a map before he had been sent there. He pressed a folded piece of paper into her hand. His fingers were already cold. For my mother, please, Reagan, please. She had promised. She had carried that folded piece of paper out of Kosovo inside her body armor. She had carried it through the debriefing and the medical review and the long flight home. She had carried it for 13 years waiting for the right moment, waiting for a day when she could stand on Opal Marsh's porch in Dayton, Ohio, and give her the last words her son had ever written. That day had not come yet, but she carried the letter still. It was folded inside a plain white envelope in the bottom of her duffel bag tucked between her spare socks and her shaving kit. She had not opened it. She would not open it. It was not hers to read. She opened her eyes. The barracks was still empty. The light through the cracked window was the color of cold iron. She reached up and touched the faint white scar that ran just below her left ear along the curve of her jaw, and for one moment her fingers trembled. Then she lowered her hand. She stood up. She went to chow. The next morning brought mail call, and mail call brought Sergeant Buck Merrick. He stood in front of the barracks with a canvas sack slung over his shoulder, calling out names, tossing envelopes into outstretched hands. Most of the recruits had letters from home. A few had packages. The air buzzed with the small, happy sounds of men and women reading their wives' handwriting and their children's drawings. When he reached the bottom of the sack, Sergeant Merrick pulled out one last envelope and held it up to the light. Hollister. Reagan stepped forward. She reached out her hand. He did not give it to her. He turned the envelope in his fingers. He squinted at the handwriting on the front, a looping old woman's script in blue ink. Now what have we here? A love letter, not a love letter. This looks like a letter from Mama. Are you writing home to Mama, sweetheart? Are you telling her how mean we've been to you? A few of the men laughed. A few did not. Merrick reached into his breast pocket. He pulled out a silver lighter. He thumbed the wheel. The flame leapt up blue and yellow, and he held the corner of the envelope to it. Reagan did not move. The envelope caught. The fire ran up the edge of the paper, turning it black and curling it inward. The handwriting in blue ink darkened and disappeared. The smell of burning paper filled the air. Merrick held the envelope by the unburned corner until the flames were almost at his fingers, and then he dropped it into the dust at his feet. Reagan watched it burn. She did not lunge. She did not cry out. She did not speak. But inside her chest, something was breaking that had nothing to do with the letter, because the handwriting in blue ink had not been her mother's handwriting. Her mother had been dead for 11 years. The handwriting had belonged to Opal Marsh of Dayton, Ohio, and the letter had not been written to Reagan. It had been written to Reagan 13 years after her son had died in response to a letter Reagan had finally worked up the courage to send 3 months ago, a letter that said, "Only I was with Eli at the end. I have something of his that belongs to you. When the time is right, I will bring it to you myself." Opal Marsh had written back. Opal Marsh had said, "Come when you can. I have been waiting." And now those words were ash in the dust at Sergeant Buck Merrick's feet. Reagan's eyes dropped to the ashes. A small wind picked up from the west, and the ashes scattered across the gravel and blew away toward the ridge. She watched them go. And then she did something that no one in the platoon saw because it happened behind her eyes in a place that only she could see. She filed the image away. The lighter, the face, the laugh, the exact angle of the sun on Sergeant Merrick's cheek at the moment the flame touched the paper. She filed it the way a soldier files a target coordinate, not for anger, not for revenge, for record. She straightened. She returned to formation. She did not look at the ashes again. High above the parade ground in the air-conditioned command building at the top of the hill, Major Damien Voss sat alone in his office with the door locked. The sun was setting through his window, throwing long orange bars across his desk. On the desk next to his clipboard sat a bottle of bourbon and a single glass. In his hand, he held a photograph. The photograph was old. It had been folded and unfolded so many times that the crease down the middle had worn through to white. It showed a young man in a West Point cadet uniform, standing next to a woman perhaps 10 years older than him, a lieutenant colonel with sharp eyes and dark hair. The young man was smiling. The woman was not. Major Voss, who had been that young man in the year 2005, remembered the day the photograph had been taken, and he remembered the day, 3 months later, when that same lieutenant colonel had stood in front of a review board and calmly and methodically destroyed his career for academic fraud. He had indeed committed, but had believed up until the moment she spoke that he had successfully hidden. She had not yelled. She had not gloated. She had simply laid out the evidence one sheet at a time in a voice so quiet the board members had to lean forward to hear her. And when she was finished, she had looked at him across the table with an expression that was not angry or triumphant, but simply terribly disappointed. And that look had stayed in him for 21 years like a splinter under the skin. He had rebuilt his career from the bottom. He had clawed his way back to the rank of major. He had made himself into a man that no woman would ever again be allowed to look at that way. And here at Fort Iron Horse, where the light never quite reached all the corners, he had made sure of it. He had made sure of it with every female recruit who had passed through his gate, and he had made sure of it this very morning when he had stood on the mess hall dais and made a dark-haired woman with no file and no rank scrub the floor on her hands and knees. He lifted the glass. He drank. He looked at the photograph. He did not yet know that the dark-haired woman in the photograph and the dark-haired woman who had scrubbed his mess hall floor that morning were separated by nothing but 12 years and a haircut. He would know soon. Out on the parade ground, the last of the daylight bled out of the sky. Reagan Hollister stood in the doorway of Barracks C with her arms folded across her chest, watching the flag come down. She did not salute. She did not need to. Her orders were in her pocket. Her patience was in her bones. And the thing that had been set in motion the day she stepped off the transport was a thing that no sergeant with a lighter and no major with a clipboard could stop. Behind her in the growing dark of the barracks, a 19-year-old private named Thatcher Hayes lay on his bunk with his face to the wall. He had been trying not to cry all day. He was a skinny boy from a small town in Kentucky, and he had enlisted because he did not know what else to do with his life, and he was going to wash out within the week, and he knew it. The men in his platoon had made him their favorite target after Reagan, and he did not have her strength. He did not have her silence. He had only the thin blanket pulled over his head and the salt burn of tears he was ashamed to shed. From the doorway, without turning around, Reagan spoke. Her voice was low. It did not carry past the bunk. "Private," Thatcher Hayes froze under his blanket. "Tomorrow when they come for you, stand up straight. Look at the wall behind them. Not at their eyes, not at their mouths, at the wall. Breathe through your nose. Count to 4 on the way in. Count to 6 on the way out. They will get bored before you do." Silence from the bunk, then a small, wet voice. "Yes, ma'am." She did not turn around. She did not smile. But for one instant, in the reflection of the window glass in front of her, Thatcher Hayes saw her face, and what he saw there was not the face of a washed-up recruit with no file. It was the face of someone who had seen men die and had decided a long time ago that she was not going to let it happen again if she could help it. Outside, the wind turned, a dry wind blowing down from the ridge, carrying the smell of sage and dust, and something else, something colder, something that tasted like what was coming. 3 days from now, on the parade ground in front of 200 men, Sergeant Buck Merrick would order a pair of clippers brought out on a tray and a wooden stool set in the dirt. 3 days from now, Major Damien Voss would watch from the dais with a faint smile on his lips, a smile that would be the last smile he ever wore in that uniform. 3 days from now, a general's tablet would light up red with the words, "Colonel Reagan Hollister Clearance Omega 7, and the whole machinery of Fort Iron Horse would grind to a stop. But tonight, on a Tuesday evening in April, in a quiet barracks at the edge of the Nevada desert, A woman stood in a doorway and watched the flag come down, and a boy on a bunk behind her breathed in for 4 and out for 6. And somewhere in a farmhouse far away, a mother named Opal Marsh sat by her window and watched the same darkness fall and waited as she had waited for 13 years for a soldier who had promised to come. The night they came for her was a Thursday, and the moon was a thin white sickle hung crooked over the ridge. Barrack C was quiet the way a trap is quiet before it springs. Reagan Hollister lay on her back on the bare springs of her bunk with her eyes closed and her breathing slow and even, and she listened. She heard them before they reached the door. 4 sets of boots moving the way men move when they are trying not to be heard and failing. She heard the soft click of a flashlight being switched on and switched off again. She heard the wet sound of bars of soap being pushed into rolled-up towels, the old prison trick, the kind of beating that leaves no bruises where the officers can see them. She heard one of them whisper to another to shut up, and she heard the whisper carry clear across the room. She counted them by footfall. 4. She let her breathing stay even. She let her arms rest at her sides under the thin blanket, and she waited. The barracks door opened on its hinges with a long, slow creak that the men had not anticipated. The lead man cursed under his breath and held up a hand, and the 4 of them froze in the doorway and waited to see if anyone would stir. No one did. The other women in the barracks were either asleep or pretending to be, and not one of them would say a word to an officer the next morning about what she had seen, because every one of them had already decided in the private calculation that is made by people who live in places like Fort Iron Horse that it was safer not to have seen anything at all. The 4 men moved down the aisle between the bunks. They reached the corner. They formed a loose half circle around her bed. The lead man, a broad-shouldered recruit named Wade Prater, with a neck like a fire hydrant and a low simmering meanness in his eyes, raised the soap-wrapped towel above his head. Reagan's hand came up from under the blanket before his arm had finished moving. Her fingers closed around his wrist. They did not close like a woman's fingers. They closed like a steel cable snapping taut. Wade Prater felt his entire arm go numb from the elbow down in the space of a single heartbeat, and he opened his mouth to cry out, and he could not. She had found the nerve cluster on the inside of his wrist with the precision of a surgeon who has done this in the dark 100 times before, and she was pressing on it with exactly enough force to shut down his voice and his arm at the same time. She sat up slowly on the bunk. The springs did not creak. Her feet touched the concrete floor without sound. She did not let go of Wade Prater's wrist. She pulled him down gently until his knees buckled, and he was kneeling on the floor beside her bunk with his face level with hers. The other 3 men stood frozen in the half circle, their towels raised, their mouths open. The moonlight from the cracked window caught her eyes as she turned them one at a time on each of the 3 standing men. She did not speak. She did not blink. She only looked at them. And in the silver light coming through that window, her eyes were not the eyes of a woman who was frightened or a woman who was angry. Her eyes were the eyes of a predator who had already decided with complete calm and complete clarity that she could kill every man in that room in under 9 seconds and did not particularly feel like doing it tonight. Wade Prater made a small whimpering sound through his closed throat. Reagan released his wrist. He crumpled onto the concrete, clutching his arm to his chest, breath coming back to him in a ragged rush. He scrambled backward on his heels and his hands. The other 3 men backed away with him, their towels falling from nerveless fingers, the soap bars thumping onto the floor like dropped stones. They reached the door. They did not turn their backs to her. They walked backward out of the barracks, and the last one, a tall, thin boy whose name was Sutter Vale, pulled the door shut behind him so carefully that the hinges did not creak at all. Reagan sat on the edge of her bunk in the silver moonlight for a long moment. Then she lay back down. She closed her eyes. She slept. 2 bunks away, Private Thatcher Hayes had watched the entire thing from under the edge of his blanket, and he did not sleep again until the bugle sounded. He had seen something that night that he did not have the words for. He had only the feeling of it, the shape of it pressed into the soft places of a 19-year-old mind that had never seen a real soldier at close range before. He knew now with the certainty that a boy has when he recognizes a thing he has never been told, that the woman in the corner bunk was not what anyone at Fort Iron Horse thought she was. He did not tell a soul. He was not stupid. High on the hill in his office with the door locked, Major Damian Voss was also not sleeping. He sat at his desk in the pale green glow of his banker's lamp, with the bottle of bourbon at his elbow and the photograph from 2005 pressed flat beneath his left palm. He had been drinking steadily for 3 hours, and the drink had not dulled him the way it usually did. It had sharpened him. It had pulled something up from the bottom of him that he had worked very hard to keep submerged. He was thinking about his mother. His mother had been a waitress at a diner outside of Scranton, Pennsylvania, and she had worked 12-hour shifts for 30 years to put him through school, and she had died the year before he graduated from West Point, alone in a hospital room, while he was 3 states away studying for an exam. He had told himself for 21 years that the thing he carried about Lieutenant Colonel Hollister was about his career, about the injustice of the review board, about the promotions he had not received. It was not. It had never been. It was about the fact that on the morning his mother's funeral had been held in a small church outside Scranton, he had been sitting in a disciplinary hearing, being dismantled in a quiet voice by a woman who had not even raised her eyes from her notes, and he had not been allowed to go home to bury his mother because his leave had been revoked pending the outcome of the hearing. And every time in the 21 years since, when a female officer had spoken to him in a measured tone or a female recruit had looked at him with anything other than fear, he had heard in his head the sound of dirt hitting his mother's coffin in a church he had not been permitted to enter. He stared at the photograph. The young woman's face in it was the face he had been chasing in the faces of every woman he had tormented since. He had never been able to reach her. He had only ever been able to reach the women he mistook for her. He drank. Outside his window on the parade ground, the wind shifted from the west to the north, and the temperature began to drop. The tactical qualification exercise was scheduled for Friday morning at 0800, and it was Major Voss who assigned the weapons. The rifles were laid out on a long folding table under a canvas awning, and each recruit was called forward by name to receive one and a magazine of blank rounds. When Reagan Hollister's name was called, Major Voss himself lifted the rifle from the table and handed it to her across the wood, and he watched her face as he did it. He saw nothing in her face. That was not the same thing as nothing being there. She knew the weapon was wrong before her hand closed around the stock. She could feel it in the balance. A properly maintained service rifle has a specific weight distribution, a small and particular heaviness forward of the trigger guard, and this rifle did not have it. The firing pin had been filed. She knew it without looking. She had handled too many weapons in too many dark places not to know. She said nothing. She accepted the rifle. She walked to her firing station. The course was a pop-up target range designed to test target acquisition and firing discipline under time pressure. Targets would appear at random distances and random intervals, and the recruit had 3 seconds to identify, aim, and fire. The scores were tallied by an electronic counter that recorded every hit and every miss. Over the loudspeaker, Major Voss's voice flat and bored. "Hollister, on the line, ready weapon." She raised the rifle. She found her sight picture. The first target popped up at 80 meters. She squeezed the trigger. The hammer fell. Nothing happened. The round did not fire. Her hands were moving before her mind had finished processing the failure. Her left hand came off the forestock and found the charging handle. She racked it back, cleared the misfeed, let it slam forward, and fired again. The round went. The target dropped. "Malfunction. Looks like we've got a dead recruit walking." The second target popped up at 120 meters. She fired. Click. Nothing. She cleared. She fired again. The round went. The target dropped. By the third target, she had stopped waiting for the rifle to cycle on its own. She was running it manually, her offhand moving in a rhythm so smooth it looked practiced, one round at a time, clear, and fire, the bolt working under her palm like a piece of her own body. The other recruits at the adjacent stations had slowed to watch her. She was hitting every target. She was hitting them in the center. She was hitting them faster than the men with working rifles, and her hands were bleeding from the speed of the bolt. Worked small red streaks running down her fingers and into the dust. Over the loudspeaker, there was a long silence. Then Voss's voice no longer amused. "System malfunction, range is cold. Hollister, stand down. Scores on that station are void." She lowered the rifle. She stood at attention at her station. She did not look at the loudspeaker. The electronic counter on her station had logged 42 hits in 45 seconds, a score that would have broken the base record by a margin that could not be explained away. It was unplugged before the cooling fan on the computer had stopped turning. From the dais, Major Voss watched her. He watched her more carefully than he had watched her the day before. Something in his face under the drink he had not slept off was beginning to crack. In the early afternoon, under a white sky that had begun to yellow at the edges, Reagan caught her forearm on a jagged piece of rusted razor wire at the top of the tire obstacle. The wire opened a gash from her elbow almost to her wrist, deep enough to show the white of bone for a moment before the blood came pouring up. She reached the bottom of the obstacle, rolled her sleeve down over the wound, and finished the course. She did not report to the medical tent until the afternoon formation was dismissed. The medic on duty, a private first class named Felder, who owed Sergeant Merrick a considerable amount of money from the backroom card games held in the motor pool on Wednesday nights, did not look up when she walked in. He was sitting at his desk with his boots up, drinking coffee out of a paper cup. What? She rolled up her sleeve. The bandage she had wrapped around the wound an hour earlier was soaked black. Felder glanced at it and made a face. That ain't nothing. Scratch! Go wrap it tighter. He pulled a roll of cheap gauze from a drawer and tossed it on the desk without getting up. Stop wasting my resources. He put his boots back up. He picked up his coffee. He turned his back to her to face the window. Reagan looked at his back for 3 seconds. Then she picked up the roll of gauze. She walked out. She did not slam the door. Behind the latrines in a small patch of hard dirt, where the shadow of the water tower fell at this hour, she sat down on an overturned metal bucket and laid her kit out on a folded handkerchief. A curved needle from her sewing kit, a length of heavy black thread, a small pair of scissors, a bottle of iodine she had bought at the base exchange the day before, a folded square of cotton. She cleaned the wound with the iodine. She did not flinch. She threaded the needle with her left hand because her right arm could not be trusted to hold steady through the pain that was coming. She began to stitch. Her breath stayed even. Her eyes stayed open. She made the stitches small and tight, and even the way the field surgeon in Kosovo had taught her in 2012, the long winter before Eli Marsh had died. She tied off each knot with her teeth. Her blood ran down her forearm and onto the dirt in slow dark drops, and she did not make a sound. She was halfway through the third stitch when a shadow fell across her hands. She did not look up. Her right hand under the thread had already moved 2 inches toward the hunting knife she kept in her boot. She had not decided to move her hand. It had moved on its own. It's me, a voice said. Small, young, scared. She looked up. Private Thatcher Hayes was standing at the corner of the latrine with a fresh roll of white bandage in his hands and a small tube of antibiotic ointment he had bought with his own money at the base exchange that morning. He was looking at the ground. His ears were red. I saw. On the wire, I saw. I thought you might need this. Reagan looked at him for a long moment. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She looked at the small, foolish, brave thing he was doing, carrying a roll of bandage across the compound in the full sight of anyone who cared to see for a woman that the entire base had been given permission to destroy. She reached up with her good hand. She took the bandage. Thank you, Private. He looked up then, just for a second. His eyes were wet. Ma'am, are you okay? She held his gaze. She considered the question. She considered the boy asking it. No, but I will be. He nodded. He did not know what else to do. He turned and walked away, and he did not look back, and he walked the long way around the motor pool so that no one would see where he had come from. Reagan Hollister watched him go. For the first time since she had stepped off the transport, something in her face softened. Not much, not for long, but enough that if Major Damian Voss had been watching her in that moment, he would have seen it, and he would have known in the oldest part of himself that he had already lost. He was not watching her in that moment. He was in his office with the bottle and the photograph and the slow grinding of his own unraveling. On Friday afternoon, the platoon was marched out onto the parade ground for a demonstration in hand-to-hand combat. Major Voss stood on the concrete pad at the head of the formation with his gloved hands clasped behind his back. The sun was at his shoulder. He had shaved that morning with a careful hand, and he looked as sharp and as clean as he had looked on any day of his career. He called Private Thatcher Hayes out of the line. Thatcher stepped forward. He was pale. He remembered what Reagan had told him. He fixed his eyes on the cinder block wall behind Major Voss's head. He breathed in for 4. He breathed out for 6. Hollister, you too. On the pad. Reagan stepped out of the line. She walked to the concrete pad. She stood at attention across from the boy. This recruit is weak. This recruit is a liability. This recruit is going to get someone killed in the field because he does not have the spine that God gave a jellyfish. We have tried encouragement. We have tried discipline. We have tried patience. He let the last word hang in the air. It is time for something stronger. He turned to Reagan. Recruit Hollister, you will strike this soldier in the face. You will break his nose. You will do it now. That is a direct order. The formation was silent. The wind blew across the parade ground. Reagan did not move. Recruit. She did not move. Major Voss took a step closer to her. His voice dropped. It was no longer for the formation. It was for her. Recruit, you will strike this soldier, or you will take his punishment for him. Those are your options. Choose. Reagan turned her head. She looked at Thatcher Hayes. The boy was trembling, but he was holding his eyes on the wall just as she had told him, and he was breathing in for 4 and out for 6. She turned her head back. She looked at Major Damien Voss. "Sir, I will not strike a teammate." The formation did not move. No one in it was breathing. Major Voss stared at her for 3 seconds. His face went white, and then red, and then a strange dark color that had no name. A vein came up at his temple. His gloved right hand closed into a fist at his side. He turned without a word and struck Private Thatcher Hayes across the face with the back of his gloved hand. The blow was not a trained blow. It was the blow of a man who had lost control. Thatcher's head snapped to the side. His knees buckled. He went down onto the concrete on one knee, and the blood came out of his nose in a thick, bright ribbon. Reagan did not move. Major Voss turned back to her. He was breathing hard now. The vein at his temple was pulsing. Insubordination, direct refusal of a lawful order in the presence of the platoon. "Congratulations, recruit. You just made this easy." She said nothing. He turned to Sergeant Buck Merrick, who was standing at the edge of the pad with his arms crossed and a small curl of satisfaction at the corner of his mouth. "Sergeant, convene the platoon on the parade ground at 1600. We are going to address the issue of recruit appearance." Merrick nodded once. The curl at his mouth deepened. "Yes, sir, with pleasure." 8 miles away on a dirt road that ran along the eastern edge of Fort Iron Horse, a black government sedan kicked up a long plume of dust as it climbed the rise toward the base. In the passenger seat, Lieutenant Porter Ashcroft held a pair of field binoculars against the side window and watched the parade ground through the heat shimmer of the afternoon air. Porter Ashcroft was 34 years old. He was from a small coastal town north of Boston. He had pale blonde hair that was going gray at the temples already, and a long, sharp nose and eyes the color of wet slate. He had been lieutenant to General Harlan Briggs for 3 years. He had been sent ahead of the general's arrival to conduct what was officially described in the paperwork as a site familiarization visit, and was in truth an advance reconnaissance of a base that had begun over the last 18 months to generate a pattern of complaints that could not be ignored any longer. He raised the binoculars. He adjusted the focus. The parade ground snapped into clarity. He saw the concrete pad. He saw the major in the crisp uniform turning away from a woman standing at attention. He saw a boy on one knee with blood running out of his nose. He saw the back of the woman's head, the dark ponytail, the set of her shoulders. And then the woman turned slightly to watch the boy fall, and the afternoon sun caught the side of her neck, below her left ear, and Lieutenant Porter Ashcroft saw the scar. The binoculars dropped an inch in his hands. He was not in the sedan on that dirt road any longer. He was 23 years old, a new lieutenant on his first deployment, and he was trapped under a collapsed concrete wall in a warehouse on the outskirts of a town south of Mitrovica in Kosovo, and the air around him was full of smoke and the sound of a building settling into itself. His left leg was pinned. He could not feel his left foot. He was going to die there. He had already accepted it. He was 23 years old, and he had already accepted it, and he was praying the Lord's Prayer in a whisper when a hand came down through the smoke and closed around his wrist, and a voice he did not recognize said, "Look at me, Lieutenant. You are coming out of here. Look at me." He had looked up. Through the smoke, a face. A woman's face. Dark hair pulled back. Blood running down the side of her neck from a wound just under her left ear that she had not yet noticed. Eyes that held his the way a parent's eyes hold a child's in a hospital waiting room. "You are coming out of here," she had said again. On 3. 1, 2. And then the wall had come up, somehow impossibly, the woman's shoulder under its edge, and his leg had come free, and hands were pulling him backward across the rubble, and the last thing he had seen before they loaded him into the medical helicopter was the woman standing in the doorway of the warehouse with blood all down her neck and collar, already turning to go back in for someone else. He had never learned her name. He had asked later in the hospital, and he had been told that the operation he had been part of did not officially exist, and therefore neither did the people who had come for him, and that he was not to speak of it to anyone, ever for any reason, and that his life was now the gift of people whose names he would never know, and that the only way to repay the gift was to live it well. He had lived it well. He had become a good officer. He had risen. He had served General Briggs with discipline and loyalty for 3 years. And through all of it, in the quiet hours, he had carried in the back of his mind the face of the woman in the warehouse doorway, and he had known in the way that a man knows these things that one day he would see that face again. He had not expected it to be today. He had not expected it to be in a pair of binoculars on a dirt road in Nevada. He had not expected it to be on the neck of a woman standing at attention in front of a major who had just knocked a boy to the concrete. "Sir," the driver said. He had not answered the driver. The driver tried again. Sir, are you all right, sir? Porter Ashcroft lowered the binoculars. His hands were shaking so hard he could not keep them still. He pressed them flat against his thighs. He looked at the dashboard. He looked at his own pale reflection in the windshield. He took a long breath in through his nose. Drive, slow, straight to the command building. Do not stop. Do not speak to anyone. Sir, my orders. Drive, Lieutenant. The driver drove. As the sedan rolled through the gate of Fort Iron Horse, Porter Ashcroft opened the secure laptop in his lap. His fingers moved across the keyboard with a speed that betrayed how much of his control he was spending on not weeping. He pulled up the encrypted channel to the Pentagon. He began the authentication sequence for clearance Omega-7. He knew. He had always known somewhere that it had to be Omega-7. You did not pull a lieutenant out of an operation that did not exist unless the woman pulling him out had a clearance so high that the operation that did not exist was hers. He had been told to say nothing until the general arrived. He was going to obey that order. He was going to obey it because that was what soldiers did. But his hands on the keyboard were already beginning the pre-authentication that the general would need when the moment came. 6 bunks away from Reagan's in Barrack C, in the bunk that nobody ever paid attention to because the man who slept in it made a point of being uninteresting, Corporal Dean Wexler was cleaning his weapon. Dean Wexler was 31 years old. His file said he was a re-enlisted infantryman who had washed out of a special operations selection course 2 years ago and was being recycled through a basic proficiency program. His file was a work of art. It had been constructed by a team of 4 analysts at the Pentagon over a period of 2 weeks in the fall of the previous year, and every detail of it, down to the dental records, would hold up to any scrutiny, short of what was coming. The truth was that Dean Wexler had been on the ground at Fort Iron Horse since October of 2025. He had been sent by Colonel Reagan Hollister through channels that did not touch any computer at the Department of Defense as the forward asset of an investigation that had been opened 18 months earlier into a pattern of unexplained medical discharges, destroyed careers, and one confirmed suicide of a female private named Cora Whitfield, who had hanged herself in the Fort Iron Horse barracks latrine in the spring of 2024, and whose parents had refused to stop asking questions. Cora Whitfield's mother had written to her congressman. The congressman had written to a friend. The friend had made a phone call. The phone call had reached a desk at the Pentagon that had a woman sitting behind it, a woman with dark hair going gray at the temples and a faint scar below her left ear, and the woman had read the file and closed it and gotten up and walked 3 floors down to a vault that contained the names of people she could call on, and she had called Dean Wexler. He had been at Fort Iron Horse for 6 months. In those 6 months, he had recorded 340 hours of audio from a pin microphone concealed in a button of his fatigue shirt. He had recorded 98 hours of video from a camera the size of a grain of rice mounted in the brim of his cap. He had copied 17 pages of off-book financial records from Sergeant Buck Merrick's locked desk drawer during a staged drunken wander through the administration building on a Saturday night. He had documented by name 41 separate incidents of physical assault, sexual harassment, and criminal hazing carried out by Sergeant Merrick Major Voss and 11 other enlisted men against recruits of both sexes but predominantly against women. He had everything. He had been waiting for a trigger. He had been told that when the trigger came, he would know. The trigger had arrived 4 days ago on a Dusty's transport truck with a duffel bag over her shoulder and no insignia on her collar. He had recognized her in the doorway of Barrack C on the night of her arrival, and he had not let the recognition touch his face. He had watched. He had continued to record. He had waited for her signal. He was cleaning his weapon on his bunk at 1600 hours on Friday afternoon when Sergeant Merrick's voice came over the compound loudspeaker calling the platoon to assembly on the parade ground. Dean Wexler looked up at the speaker. He looked down at his weapon. He smiled just a little for the first time in 6 months. It was time. On the parade ground, the formation was being called into ranks. The wooden stool from the barber shack was being carried out by a private in a white apron. Behind the stool in a metal tray on a folding table sat a pair of electric clippers plugged into an extension cord that ran back to the generator shed. Above the ridge to the north, the first dark clouds were beginning to stack themselves against the sky. Reagan Hollister walked to the center of the parade ground. She stood at attention in front of the stool. She did not look at Sergeant Merrick. She did not look at Major Voss. She looked straight ahead at a point somewhere beyond the ridge, at a point that only she could see. She was thinking about the cover of a book. The book was called The Voss Method. It was a training manual used at Fort Iron Horse and at 3 other training installations across the western United States, and it had been Major Damian Voss's ticket out of obscurity after his long, slow climb back from the review board in 2005. She had seen a copy of it in the major's office during the brief administrative review of her transfer on her first morning at the base. She had noted the cover. She had noted the date of publication 2016. She had noted on the spine of the book where the binding was beginning to wear a faint old marking in dark ink half worn away that read HD 2014. She had written that manual in 2014. She had been 30 years old. She had written it in the 6 months after Kosovo, in a small office in Arlington, at the request of a two-star general who had read her after-action reports and had told her that the U.S. Army needed what was in her head written down and distributed to the force. She had titled it The Hollister Doctrine. She had signed it. She had delivered the manuscript on a Thursday afternoon in October of 2014, and she had never seen it again. 2 years later, a classified addendum to a training program had been published under a different title by a different author with all of her signatures removed and all of her language intact. She had not pursued it at the time. She had been overseas. She had had other work. She had filed it away the way she filed everything away for a later day. This was the day. The barber stepped up behind the stool. He switched on the clippers. The motor came alive with a high, angry buzz that carried across the parade ground in the still afternoon air. Sergeant Buck Merrick stepped forward. He was smiling. "Sit down, recruit." Reagan Hollister sat down on the stool. She folded her hands in her lap. She closed her eyes for one long breath. And then she opened them and she looked straight ahead, past the flagpole, past the ridge, past the stacked dark clouds, and she waited for what was coming. The clippers came down on her scalp with a sound like a hornet caught in a jar, and the first long, dark lock of her hair fell onto her shoulder and slid down her uniform into the dust at her feet. Sergeant Buck Merrick stood 3 paces back, with his arms folded across his chest, smiling the smile of a man who had waited a long time for a feast and was finally being allowed to sit down to the table. 2 military policemen, neither of them asked for, and neither of them necessary, held her shoulders down against the stool as if she were a struggling animal that needed restraining. She was not struggling. She had not moved a muscle since she sat down. Their hands on her shoulders were for the benefit of the 200 men watching a piece of theater staged to make the humiliation look like a victory over resistance that had never existed. Merrick narrated the thing as it happened the way a carnival barker narrates a freak show. "You see this, boys? You see what happens? A recruit comes in here thinking she is something special. A recruit comes in here with no file, no record, no history, and she thinks that makes her mysterious. It does not make her mysterious. It makes her nothing. It makes her a blank page. And today we write on the blank page. Today we write the word that she is." The clippers made another pass. Another long dark lock fell. From the front row of the formation, Rhett Barrett laughed. It was a forced laugh. He had been laughing at her for 4 days because laughing at her was what the older men expected of him, and because the alternative was to think about what he had seen in the mess hall on Tuesday morning when she had stepped over his boot without looking down. He did not want to think about that. He laughed. Bald and broke. Perfect match. A few other voices joined him, but fewer than there had been on Tuesday. Fewer than there had been on Wednesday. The laughter was thinner now, and some of the men were no longer laughing at all. Something had been shifting through the platoon all week, a slow unease that none of them could name. And now as they watched the clippers eat through her hair, they were beginning to feel that unease sharpen into something very close to fear. Private Thatcher Hayes was not laughing. He was standing at rigid attention in the 4th row with a bandage over his broken nose, his eyes fixed on the far wall, his breath slow and measured the way she had taught him. His fists were clenched so tight his knuckles were white. He was 19 years old, and he understood in the way that a young man sometimes understands a thing without being taught that he was watching the most important moment of his entire life, and that he would measure every moment that came after it against this one. Corporal Dean Wexler was not laughing either. He was standing in the 6th row with his cap pulled low over his eyes and his hands clasped loosely behind his back. The camera in the brim of his cap was recording. The microphone in the 3rd button of his fatigue shirt was recording. The signal was being transmitted in real time through a relay tucked into the lining of his boot to a receiving station 41 miles away that was operated by the Inspector General of the United States Army. He was not smiling, his face was carefully blank. But inside his chest, something that had been wound tight for 6 months was beginning to loosen. On the stool, Reagan Hollister did not close her eyes. She watched the wall of the command building beyond the parade ground. She watched the clouds stacking themselves above the ridge. She kept her breathing slow and even, and she let the clippers do their work. When the last of her hair fell, the barber stepped back, and the two military policemen released her shoulders, and Sergeant Merrick thrust a small handheld mirror at her face. "Take a look, nobody. Take a good long look at what you are." She glanced at the mirror for half a second. She handed it back. "Done." Her voice was flat. Her voice was not broken. And then the rain came. It came down the ridge from the north. The way rain comes in the Nevada high desert, suddenly and hard, a black curtain sweeping across the parade ground in the space of 30 seconds. The temperature dropped 20 degrees before any man in the formation had time to pull a poncho from his pack. The water hit Reagan's bare scalp in cold, stinging sheets, and it ran down her face and into the collar of her uniform, and it washed the loose hairs off her shoulders and turned the dust at her feet into a dark paste. Merrick and Voss pulled their ponchos on with practiced speed. They stood dry on the concrete pad watching her. She did not rise from the stool. She sat in the rain with her scalp pale and exposed, and her shoulders square, and her spine straight as a plumb line, and she did not shiver, and she did not lift a hand to shield her face, and she did not look away from the point beyond the ridge that she had fixed her eyes on when the clippers first started. Major Voss made a note on his clipboard. His handwriting was shakier than it had been that morning. He did not know why. Behind him, unheard over the hiss of the rain, the gate sentry's radio crackled. "Command, command, gate 1. General's vehicle at the gate. Repeat, general's vehicle at the gate. He is on the ground. He is on the ground now." The Green Army Jeep came through the main gate at 20 miles an hour and did not slow down. Its tires threw long rooster tails of muddy water as it crossed the compound, and its headlights cut twin yellow tunnels through the rain, and it stopped at the edge of the parade ground with a bark of brakes that made every man in the formation flinch. The driver's door opened. A stocky man in his early 60s stepped out under the downpour. He wore the 2 stars of a major general on each shoulder, and he wore the kind of weather-beaten campaign cover that told you he had spent more of his career outdoors than indoors. His name was Harlan Briggs. He had been in the Army for 41 years. He had been called that afternoon on a secure line by his own lieutenant, who had told him in a voice so strained it was almost unrecognizable that he needed to come to Fort Iron Horse now immediately without announcement, and that he needed to bring his command tablet with him. He had not asked why. He trusted Porter Ashcroft. He had come. He saw the woman on the stool. He saw the 2 officers standing dry on the concrete pad. He saw the platoon at parade rest in the rain. He did not yet understand what he was looking at. He understood only that something was very wrong and that he was about to find out what. Major Voss stepped forward with a sharp salute. "General Briggs, sir, we did not receive notification of your arrival. We are currently conducting a disciplinary action against—" "Who is that woman?" Voss blinked at the interruption. "Sir, that is recruit Hollister, a new transfer. She has demonstrated a pattern of insubordination that—" "Why is she sitting in the rain?" "Sir, it is part of a corrective measure to—" "Why is her head shaved, Major?" Voss's mouth opened, closed, opened again. "Sir, appearance discipline is a standard." Sergeant Merrick, sensing the wind shifting and believing he could still steer it, stepped forward and gestured toward Reagan with a proprietary wave. "Sir, permit me. We are teaching her a lesson in humility. With respect, sir, her file is empty. She comes to us with no record of any kind. She is what we call a blank slate. We have had to correct her from the ground up." General Briggs looked at Sergeant Buck Merrick for a long moment. Rain ran off the brim of his cover and down his cheeks. He said nothing. Then he turned to his lieutenant, who had stepped out of the passenger side of the Jeep with the command tablet already open in his hands. Porter Ashcroft's face was the color of paper. His hands were steady now. He had stopped trembling the moment the Jeep had crossed the gate, the way a man's hands sometimes stop trembling the moment the thing he has been dreading finally arrives. "Lieutenant, the tablet." "Sir, pre-authenticated, sir. Omega-7 channel is open." General Briggs took the tablet. He looked down at the screen. He looked up at the woman on the stool. He looked at her scalp pale and wet in the rain. He looked at her eyes. And then, as a formality, because 41 years in the Army had taught him never to skip a formality, even when he already knew the answer, he tapped the tablet once and brought it up to face her. The camera on the back of the tablet swept across her features. The facial recognition software linked through the encrypted channel to a server 3,000 miles away found her in 0.4 of a second. The screen turned red. General Briggs looked down at the red screen. He read the words printed across it. He read them a second time, and the color left his face in one long, slow wave starting at his hairline and draining down to his collar. "My God." Then louder, "Halt." The single word cracked across the parade ground like a rifle shot. Every man in the formation froze. Sergeant Merrick, who had been halfway through another self-satisfied gesture, froze with his arm in the air. Major Voss, who had just been drawing breath to speak again, closed his mouth with an audible click. General Briggs turned to face the two men. Rainwater ran down the creases of his 41-year-old face. When he spoke, his voice was not loud. It did not need to be loud. You imbeciles. You absolute career-ending parade ground imbeciles. Do you have any idea? Do you have the faintest, dimmest, most microscopic idea what you have done? Sir, Voss began. Quiet. Voss went quiet. The general held the tablet up so that both of the men on the concrete pad could see the screen. The red text glowed through the rain. Neither man moved, neither man breathed. The screen read, Identity confirmed. Colonel Reagan A. Hollister, United States Army. Clearance Omega 7. Active investigative authority. Do not impede, do not detain, do not address without salutation. Sergeant Buck Merrick made a small choking sound that was not a word. Major Damian Voss stared at the screen and did not move for 7 full seconds. His face had gone a gray color that was not in the spectrum of healthy human skin tones. The rain ran down his forehead and dripped off the end of his sharp nose, and he did not feel it. General Briggs turned the tablet. He swiped to the next screen. The addendum finished loading. He read it silently. His eyes moved from line to line, and with each line, his mouth grew tighter, and when he reached the bottom of the document, he swore under his breath a word that 41 years of military decorum had trained out of him in public, and he said it anyway. He looked up at Voss. Major, the manual, the Voss method. Voss swallowed. He could not seem to find his voice. You published it in 2016. Yes, sir, a whisper. Under your own name. Yes, sir. This addendum I am reading tells me that the original document submitted to Arlington in October of 2014 was titled The Hollister Doctrine, and that every sentence in your manual, every tactical principle, every formatting choice, every footnote, was written by the woman you have had sitting in the rain for the last 40 minutes. Does any of that sound familiar to you, Major? Voss's clipboard slipped out of his gloved hand. It clattered onto the wet concrete. He said, you have been grading the architect on her own blueprints. You have been failing her for violating protocols she wrote. You have been correcting her doctrine with her doctrine. In what universe, Major, in what conceivable universe did you believe that this would end any way other than exactly how it is ending right now? Voss's knees went. He did not fall. He locked them at the last possible instant, but his body swayed, and a man in the second row of the formation who was watching closely would later tell his wife that he had seen the moment a human being's soul leave his body while he was still standing. Reagan Hollister stood up from the stool. She did it slowly. She did it without ceremony. She brushed the loose hair from her shoulders with one calm sweep of her right hand, and she stepped off the stool and she walked across the wet ground to the edge of the concrete pad. Her bare scalp was pale in the rain. Her uniform was soaked black. She stopped 3 feet from Sergeant Buck Merrick, and she looked up at him because he was taller than she was, and she let him see her face for the first time in 4 days without the mask she had worn. Merrick was shaking. It had started in his hands and moved up into his shoulders, and now it was in his jaw, and his toothpick had fallen out of his mouth sometime in the last minute, and he had not noticed. Colonel, I did not know, I did not. Sergeant, be quiet. He was quiet. She reached up with her right hand. She took the stripes on his collar between her thumb and her forefinger. They were sewn on with military thread, reinforced at every corner, the kind of stitching that was meant to last a 20-year career. She pulled. The fabric tore with a long, ripping sound that was audible in the formation over the hiss of the rain. She held the torn stripes up in front of his face for a long moment so that he could see them. His own eyes followed the stripes the way a dying man's eyes follow a priest. Then she let them fall. They hit the mud at her feet and sank into the wet brown earth. Rank is earned, and you are overdrawn. Sergeant Buck Merrick made a small high sound in his throat and went down onto both knees in the mud. He did not look at her. He looked at the torn stripes sinking into the water. He had been a sergeant for 19 years. He had been the king of this small kingdom for 19 years. And he had lost it all in the space of 4 sentences. Reagan turned. Major Damian Voss was backing away from her across the concrete pad with his hands raised not in surrender but in some incoherent half gesture of explanation, as if he believed there were still words he could say that would make this stop. Colonel, please. There is a misunderstanding. The manual was a collaborative. I was part of a working group. The attribution was. There was an administrative error. I can show you the paperwork. Reagan raised one hand, just the one, palm out. Voss stopped talking with his mouth still open around the next word. Lieutenant Ashcroft. Ma'am, freeze the major's accounts, all of them. Pension, investments, any deposits made into personal accounts from base discretionary funds over the last 10 years. Flag the entire portfolio for audit under the gross misconduct statute. Ma'am, initiating now. Porter Ashcroft's fingers moved across the tablet. A series of soft chimes sounded from the speaker. 3,000 miles away in a windowless room in Virginia, a trio of forensic accountants who had been on standby for 18 months began receiving data. Major Damian Voss's knees gave out, and he went down on the concrete pad. He did not kneel. He collapsed. He landed on his hands and his knees, and he stayed there, and he looked at his own hands, and what he saw in his own hands was the full understanding that not only was his career ending at this exact moment, not only was he going to leave Fort Iron Horse with nothing but the clothes on his back, but he was going to leave it owing the United States government a sum of money so large that the remainder of his life would be dedicated in its entirety to not repaying it. He began to cry. Reagan looked down at him. Her face did not change. She stepped over him the way she had stepped over Rhett Barrett's boot on Tuesday morning, without looking down, without breaking stride, and she continued past him toward the center of the concrete pad, and when she reached it, she turned to face the platoon. She said nothing for a long moment. She simply looked at them. 200 men standing at parade rest in the rain, and one by one each of their gazes dropped to the ground because not one of them could meet her eyes. From the sixth row, Corporal Dean Wexler stepped out of formation. He crossed the parade ground at a quiet, measured walk. When he reached her, he came to attention and offered a sharp, crisp salute, and then he reached into the side pocket of his rucksack and withdrew a small, matte black hard drive the size of a paperback book. He held it out to her on the flat of his palm. Colonel, 6 months, 340 audio hours, 98 video, 41 documented incidents, financial records from the sergeant's office, named participants 43, named victims 112. Ready for handover, ma'am. She took the drive. She closed her hand around it. She nodded once. Thank you, Corporal. Ma'am. He stepped back. He did not return to formation. He stood at her right shoulder where he should have been standing all along. Reagan turned to General Briggs. Sir, with your permission, I would like to address the platoon. The floor is yours, Colonel. She turned back to face the 200 men. For 4 days you have watched. Some of you have laughed. Some of you have participated. A smaller number of you have done nothing, which is its own kind of participation. I am not going to court-martial you. I am not going to call your names. I am not going to make an example of any of you because an example would be a mercy, and a mercy is not what you have earned. She let that sit in the rain for a long moment. You will finish your training. Most of you will graduate. You will go to your units. You will go on with your careers. And for the rest of your lives, every time you look in a mirror, you will remember what you did here this week. You will remember what you laughed at. You will remember what you allowed. And you will know with perfect clarity that the person looking back at you from that mirror is the person you chose to be at Fort Iron Horse in April of 2026. That is your punishment. I am not adding to it. I do not have to. She looked at Rhett Barrett in the front row. He was weeping openly. He could not stop. His shoulders were heaving. She did not look at him long. Her eyes moved through the platoon row by row until they found Private Thatcher Hayes in the fourth row, standing with his bandaged nose and his wet uniform, and his eyes fixed on the wall past her left shoulder, breathing in for 4 and out for 6. She held his gaze for a long moment. She gave him one small nod. It was the only nod she gave. Thatcher Hayes came to attention. He saluted her. His salute was perfect. His hand did not shake. She returned the salute. Then she turned to General Briggs. Sir, I am finished here for today. The hard drive Corporal Wexler has provided will be delivered to the Inspector General tonight by courier. I will be departing the base within the hour. I would request that the platoon be dismissed to barracks and that the 2 officers on the ground be taken into custody by the MPs and held for the federal marshals who will arrive at 0700 tomorrow. Consider it done, Colonel. Thank you, sir. She walked off the concrete pad and across the parade ground toward the command building. She did not hurry. She did not look back. The rain was beginning to thin. Somewhere in the ridge to the north, a thin band of blue sky had opened between the clouds, and a single shaft of late afternoon sun had begun to cut through. The light found her bare scalp as she crossed the open ground, and it was the last image that most of the men in the platoon would ever be able to remember clearly from that day. A woman in a soaked uniform walking alone across a wet parade ground with the sun coming through the clouds above her. That was how they would see her for the rest of their lives. Some of them would wake up in the middle of the night 20 years later, and that was the image they would see before they opened their eyes. 4 days later, she was in Dayton, Ohio. The house was small. It sat on a quiet street of small houses with a narrow front porch and a wooden mailbox painted dark green and a pot of red geraniums on the top step. The lawn was trimmed, the walk was swept. Everything about the house said that somebody who lived in it still cared about small things. Reagan Hollister got out of the rental car. She was wearing civilian clothes for the first time in 4 days. A dark wool coat, a pair of jeans, a soft knit cap pulled down over her scalp because her hair was still only a dark shadow under the skin, and she did not want the woman inside the house to see it before she had to. In her right hand, she carried a plain white envelope. It was not the envelope that Sergeant Merrick had burned. It was the photocopy she had made 13 years ago, the day after Eli died, because she had known even then that she would not trust any single copy to survive the journey home. She walked up the narrow path to the porch. She climbed the 3 steps. She stood at the front door and raised her hand to knock, and then she lowered her hand and stood on the porch for a full minute with her eyes closed, and she let herself feel for the first time in 13 years the weight of what she was about to do. Then she knocked. The door opened. A woman stood in the doorway. She was 68 years old. She was small and round, and her hair was the color of winter grass. Her eyes were Eli's eyes. They had always been Eli's eyes. Reagan had known the first time Eli had pulled a picture of his mother out of his wallet in a tent in Kosovo that the eyes were going to be the hardest thing. The woman looked at her. The woman looked at the envelope in her hand. The woman looked at her face. Oh, you came. Ma'am, I am sorry I took so long. Opal Marsh reached out. She took Reagan's free hand in both of her own. Her hands were warm. They were small and dry and warm, and they held Reagan's hand the way a mother holds a child's hand crossing a street. Come in, sweetheart. The kettle is on. They sat at the kitchen table. The kitchen was yellow, and there was a round rag rug under the table, and the light through the window over the sink was the long gold light of an autumn afternoon in Ohio. Opal Marsh poured 2 cups of tea. She set a plate of cookies between them. Chocolate chip. Reagan looked at the cookies and did not speak for a long time. He told me about these. In Kosovo. Before. Opal nodded. Her eyes were wet. She did not wipe them. Reagan set the envelope on the table between them. Her hand rested on it. He wrote this on the 22nd of December, 2013. He gave it to me 3 days later. He asked me to bring it to you. I have carried it since. I should have come sooner. I am sorry. Opal Marsh put her hand over Reagan's hand. She shook her head just a little. You came now. You came when you could. I have been waiting. I will keep waiting a little while longer while you drink your tea. And Reagan Hollister, 42 years old, Colonel of the United States Army, recipient of decorations that had never been announced and never would be, who had stood on a parade ground in the rain 4 days earlier with her head bare and her eyes on a point past the flagpole, put her face down into her hands at Opal Marsh's kitchen table and wept for the first time in 13 years. She wept for Eli. She wept for Opal. She wept for a woman named Cora Whitfield, who had hanged herself in a barracks latrine in 2024 and whose mother had refused to stop asking questions. She wept for the boy with the bandaged nose in the 4th row of the formation. She wept for the woman she had been at 30 years old writing a manual in a small office in Arlington, who had not known yet that the work would outlive her and be stolen by a man she had never met. Opal Marsh did not say a word. She sat across the table and she held Reagan's hand and she waited. Outside the window, the long gold light of Ohio slid slowly down the kitchen wall. 3 months later, in the middle of July, Fort Iron Horse was a different place. The base had been placed under direct command of the Office of the Inspector General for 60 days while a full structural review was conducted. 17 men had been court-martialed. 3 had received prison sentences. 4 had been given general discharges with loss of all benefits. 10 had been reduced in rank and transferred to remote postings where they would finish their careers counting inventory in warehouses they would not be allowed to leave. Sergeant Buck Merrick had received 11 years at Fort Leavenworth. Major Damian Voss had received 18. A new commander had been appointed, a new sergeant major, a new training doctrine. The doctrine had been printed with a new cover, a plain dark blue with silver lettering, and the title on the cover was simple. It read The Hollister Doctrine by Colonel Reagan A. Hollister, United States Army. The spine was not worn. The binding was fresh. On the inside of the front cover in small letters, a dedication had been added that had not appeared in the 2014 original. For Sergeant Eli Marsh, for Private Cora Whitfield, for every soldier who was not believed until it was too late. Colonel Reagan Hollister stood on the reviewing stand at the Fort Iron Horse graduation ceremony that July morning. She wore her Class A uniform. Her ribbons for the first time in her career were fully displayed on her chest, and they filled it from her collar to her waist, and the men in the graduating platoon looked at her and did not know where to rest their eyes. Her hair had grown back to a short, neat cut. Her scar below her left ear was visible in the sun. In the front row of the graduating platoon at parade rest with his uniform pressed and his boots shined to a mirror, Black stood Private First Class Thatcher Hayes. He had finished his training at the top of his class. He had been selected for infantry school. He was 20 years old now, and he stood straighter than any man in the platoon. Reagan Hollister walked the line. She stopped in front of each graduating soldier. She shook each hand. When she came to Thatcher Hayes, she stopped. She took his hand. She held it 1 second longer than she had held any of the others. Private. Ma'am. In for 4. A small smile crossed his face. The first real one. Out for 6, ma'am. She nodded. She moved on. At the end of the line, she came to attention. She turned to face the flag. General Harlan Briggs stood at her right shoulder. Lieutenant Porter Ashcroft stood behind her. The national anthem began to play. Above them, the wind moved across the Nevada sky, and the sun came down clean and white on the bare parade ground, where 4 months earlier, a woman had sat on a wooden stool in the rain, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on a point past the flagpole. Rank is earned, she had said on that day. And on this day, on a clean July morning with the anthem playing and a new class of soldiers standing before her, Colonel Reagan Hollister lifted her hand in a slow and perfect salute, and the whole of Fort Iron Horse to the last man saluted with her.